Good day all. This talk will look at subjectivist theories of crime. We shall begin with those theories that are most similar to some of the structuralist theories we have already looked at in an earlier talk. The most well-known of these is Edwin Sutherland's theory of differential association, which he developed in the late 1930s. The concept of differential association operates on two levels. Firstly, it refers to the people that an individual associates with. If he associates with criminals more than with law-abiding people, then he is more likely to become a criminal himself. Sutherland and others have collected plenty of evidence to show that people who hang out with criminals are themselves more likely to eventually engage in criminal behavior, especially if they begin doing so as teenagers. However, Sutherland's main focus was on the second level of association, that of meaning. Here, differential association refers to the different meanings which we associate with specific behaviors. Sutherland, like all subjectivists, states that the way we act depends on the meanings we assign to our situation, or in other words, how we understand or define our situation, as W.I. Thomas put it. Sutherland then goes on to argue that we will only engage in a particular action if, in our minds, it is favorably defined. In other words, we'll only do something if we think it's the right thing to do, even if other people disagree. So, to engage in crime, we have to redefine crime to ourselves so that we think of it as right. We do that by hanging out with people who are already criminals and so already define crime favorably, and isolating ourselves from people who define crime unfavorably, like police officers. Only once favorable definitions of crime outweigh unfavorable definitions in the individual's mind will they associate crime with positive behavior. And only once their thinking has changed in this way will they engage in criminal behavior. In short, by associating with criminals, you learn to think like a criminal, and then you start to act like a criminal. This theory is very similar to the subculture theory developed by Albert Cohen and others. Essentially, Sutherland is saying that the individual enters into a criminal subculture or counterculture, which then guides their thoughts and actions. Where Sutherland differed primarily from Cohen and other structuralists was in applying his theory not just to working class crime, but also to white-collar crime or sweet crime, the crimes of the middle and upper classes. Sutherland said that every social structure, every social role, every occupation, every area of society will generate its own subculture. Modern society contains many different subcultures, and some of those subcultures will have definitions or meanings which clash with those of the law. In particular, Sutherland focused not on the subculture of the poor, such as street gangs, but on the subculture of the rich, the subculture of big business. Sutherland said that the business world had its own subculture with its own definitions and its own values. In a nutshell, the business world values business positively and anything that gets in the way of business negatively. So, business persons place a positive value on being competitive and making a profit, and their ultimate value is money. On the flip side, they place a negative value on anything that cuts into profits, such as trade unions that fight for higher workers' wages, or laws that restrain corporations in order to protect the environment. Such things are dismissed as being the work of communists or socialists or bleeding heart liberals or tree huggers, and so on. Sutherland argued that after you've worked in this business subculture for a while, you will believe that its values are higher values than those of the common people or society at large. You will believe that making a profit is more important than following the law, and so you'll consider yourself justified in breaking the law as long as it increases profits. Sutherland's ideas on sweet crime have been taken up by Marxists who have collected evidence that big corporations routinely break the law and that the business class does indeed have a criminal subculture. Sutherland's basic idea is that people act on the basis of their values and morals. So, in order to commit a crime, people have to redefine that crime as morally right. In other words, they have to justify breaking the law to themselves. Donald Cressey, in the early 70s, applied this idea to a study of embezzlement. He interviewed over 100 convicted embezzlers and came to the conclusion that all of them had engaged in embezzlement only after they had redefined it as morally right, or in other words, had come up with a justification for it. Such justifications included, I was only borrowing the money, but I got caught before I could return it. Or, I was in a tight spot, and everyone steals when they're in a tight spot. And so on. Before that, in the late 50s, Graham Sykes and David Matza developed Sutherland's ideas into what they termed neutralization theory. This is very similar to Walter Reckless' containment theory, which we looked at in the talk on structuralism. Sykes and Matza argued that we've all been socialized to feel guilt and shame if we break the law, including criminals. After criminals are caught, Sykes and Matza say that many of them proclaim genuine feelings of guilt and shame for their actions. But while they're committing their crimes, they contain or neutralize these feelings of guilt and shame through 5 psychological techniques of neutralization. Briefly, these are a denial of responsibility for your actions, for example, by blaming your parents for a bad upbringing. A denial of injury, for example, by saying nobody was really harmed by your actions. A denial of the victim, for example, saying they deserved it. A condemnation of the condemners, for example, saying the police only arrested you because they're prejudiced against you. Or finally, an appeal to higher loyalties, for example, saying you had to steal to feed your children. All of these theorists emphasize that the vast majority of criminals are not immoral, psychopathic monsters the way the media often makes them out to be. Rather, they're ordinary people who just hold different values and a different definition of their situation to most people. However, there is one big problem with this approach, and it is the old chicken and egg question. Which came first, the crime or the justification? Sutherland and his followers say that before you commit a crime, you first have to redefine it as right or neutralize your guilt, or in a word, justify it. But critics have argued that the problem with all these studies is that they're based on interviews with convicted criminals. And the problem with that is that every convicted criminal has had to go to court. And in court, every criminal tries to justify their actions so as to get a lighter sentence. In other words, the critics say that all these theorists have done is to make a list of excuses that criminals have come up with after the fact to try to gain some sympathy from the judge and jury. We haven't been told their motivations, just their rationalizations. The critics argue that morality is something that academics are concerned with, but criminals not so much. Indeed, more recent studies have shown that when criminals are discussing and planning a crime, they don't think in moral terms, they think in tactical terms. They don't discuss whether it's right or wrong, they discuss how to do it and how to get away with it. In the early 70s, Canadian sociologist Peter Letkemann abandoned this focus on morality and conducted more open-ended interviews with convicted criminals, trying to see how they defined themselves and what they considered to be important about their situation, not what academics thought was important. Letkemann interviewed a large number of career criminals, meaning prison inmates with several convictions over a period of years, which showed a long-term commitment to a life of crime. Letkamann's main finding was that career criminals see themselves first and foremost as professionals. They see crime as a profession, like any other. You have to acquire certain skills, gain certain knowledge, put that knowledge into practice, take certain risks, and do the job. To them, crime is a job or a career, a way of making a living. They don't worry about the morality of it any more than, for example, McDonald's employees worry about the morality of killing cows for a living, which is something that millions of Hindus and millions of vegans consider to be immoral. Letkemann also found that what was important to these professional criminals was much the same as for any professional. First of all, they drew a firm distinction between professionals and amateurs. As in any line of work, professionals do a better job than amateurs. Professionals are skilled workers, amateurs are unskilled workers. Professionals are concerned with maintaining a good reputation among other professionals in their field, because that's how they get called for jobs. So, not surprisingly, professionals look down on and put down amateurs. Those Letkemann interviewed maintained that most amateur criminals were alkies and junkies. In other words, alcoholics and drug addicts who engaged in petty theft on an occasional basis in order to buy booze or drugs. Such people would of course be very unreliable and might turn up to a big job drunk or stoned. So, if you're planning a big job, you don't want to get amateurs involved. You want to call a professional who knows what he's doing. Another difference between professionals and amateurs, Letkemann found, is that amateurs are scared of being caught or even suspected of a crime because so far they never have been. If and when they are caught, most of them quit crime, while a minority become professional criminals. Professionals have been caught before, and so have a criminal record. This means that they know that the police are going to suspect them if a crime is committed in their region. So professionals are not concerned with being suspected, just with being convicted. Their main preoccupation is with not leaving behind any incriminating evidence. Police will also suspect criminals because of what's termed their modus operandi, or MO, which just means their way of operating. Like all professionals these days, criminals specialize. They learn specific job skills and commit specific crimes, such as safecracking or forgery and so on. Career criminals call this having a line. However, if the opportunity to make some money comes up, they won't turn it down just because it's not their usual line. Still, to a certain extent, criminals can be identified as suspects by their job skills or their line. Letkemann also found that there are differences in status among career criminals. And just as in any profession, your status largely depends on your education. Except that you don't get a criminal education in school. Where do you get one? In prison. Prisons are schools of crime. Prisons bring a whole lot of criminals together and give them nothing to do but sit around and talk about their crimes and basically swap job skills. I'll teach you how to crack a safe if you teach me how to disable an alarm. Letkemann found that Canadian criminals distinguish between schools of crime and colleges of crime. Because Canada has a two-tier prison system, provincial and federal. Provincial prisons hold only minor criminals, namely those with sentences under 2 years. Federal prisons hold only major criminals, namely those with sentences of 2 years or more. So, provincial prisons are like schools where you can learn minor criminal skills, while federal prisons are like colleges where you can learn major criminal skills. So, doing time in federal prison raises your status more among your fellow criminals than doing time in provincial prison. Now, you might think that going to prison would lower your status among other criminals because it would show that you were dumb enough to get caught. But criminals mostly consider getting caught to be just bad luck. In reality, going to prison raises your status because other criminals know that you come out of prison as a better, more skilled criminal than when you went in. This is why putting people in prison makes it more likely that they will return to a life of crime after their release, not less likely. I shall have more to say about this in the talks on criminal justice. Letkemann also found that when criminals talk about different types of crime, they don't use the official categories in the criminal code. Rather, they define crimes as professionals, namely, in terms of the different job skills involved in them. Letkemann argued that the distinctions they made boiled down to a choice between two different career paths involving two different types of crime: surreptitious crimes or overt crimes. Surreptitious crimes are crimes committed in hiding, like breaking into somewhere in the middle of the night. Such crimes attempt victim avoidance, which means avoidance of violence, if at all possible. Instead, such crimes require technical skills, using specialized equipment, electronics, maybe even explosives to crack a safe, say. Overt crimes are crimes which are committed openly, like holding up a convenience store in broad daylight. Such crimes do not require technical skills, but they do require social skills. Overt crimes involve victim confrontation, usually pointing a gun or some other weapon at the victim. Now, it may seem like it takes no skill to point a gun at someone and say, "Give me all your money," but it's not that simple. The potential for violence is much higher in this situation, and the skill lies in avoiding that violence. In cop shows on TV, the robber often gets the money and then shoots the clerk just for the hell of it. This is not how overt crimes work in the real world. Real robbers do not want to shoot anyone. This is not because they're nice guys, it is because they know that a convenience store robbery is a very low priority for the police. But if it becomes a homicide, then it becomes their #1 priority. And of course, the penalty for homicide is much greater than for robbery. So, a robber has to learn how to use a weapon as a symbol of violence rather than as a means of actual physical violence. And this requires unusual social skills. He has to take immediate control of the situation. He has to get complete strangers to do as he tells them without panicking or screaming or trying to fight back. Amateurs who think that all they need is a gun and who walk in sweaty and nervous and don't have a commanding presence may end up getting in a struggle and getting caught or even shot. One of the central points in all of the subjectivist theories that we've looked at is that the overwhelming majority of criminals are normal, rational people for whom crime is a rational activity, a job. The media like to portray criminals as evil, deranged psychopaths who enjoy hurting other people and care about no one but themselves. And yes, there are such people, but they are a very tiny minority of all criminals. Most career criminals are professionals. They take a craftsman's pride in their work. They learn criminal skills, and then they apply those skills in the most profitable way that they can. They use violence only as a last resort. As for the law, well, every profession has its occupational hazards. Theirs just happens to be getting locked up. So, like any other professionals, they take precautions, they try to minimize the risks, and then they get on with the job. That concludes what I have to say on the subjectivist approach to crime. A transcript of this talk is available if you're interested. Good day, all.